My dear, when I compared you to my ex, I realized they hurt me with more honesty. You didn't save me from my past. You disguised yourself as my future. My ex shattered me. You made me grateful for the breaking. You weren't love. You were a longer goodbye. At least they left quickly. You made me beg for the door. My ex burned bridges. You buried mine. You held my hand colder than my ex's silence. When I compare the two, they feel like a lesson. You feel like a test I failed. I prayed you were different. God stayed silent. You didn't heal me. You made my scars feel safe. My ex ruined memories. You ruined hope. You were just a softer lie with a better voice. I used to cry over what was lost. Now I cry over what stayed. The pain with you came dressed as peace. You didn't replace them. You confirmed them. They hurt me. You haunted me. You're not worse, just slower in destruction. Your love didn't grow me. It shrunk who I was becoming. With my ex, I lost time. With you, I lost myself. You were never better, just better at pretending. My ex left marks. You left myths I believed. You feel like betrayal rehearsed. You weren't the escape. You were the echo. They wounded my heart. You silenced it. You didn't love me more. You left me lonelier. You were the same devil with dimmer lights. I don't miss my ex anymore. I miss the strength I had escaping them. They broke my heart. You broke my soul. At least they warned me with chaos. You poisoned me with calm. You were the promise after pain. And still, you lied. You made me miss the person who shattered me. You weren't a step up. You were just a step sideways into hell. You didn't come with red flags. You were the red silence. They hurt me loud. You hurt me softly, daily. You were supposed to show me new love, not newer pain. You didn't build me. You studied how to dismantle me gently. You were just their shadow with a sweeter tone. Even my demons warned me about you. You disguised destruction as devotion. My past screamed. You whispered the same lie. You were not different. You were slower poison. You gave me the same scars, just cleaner. You weren't my ex's opposite. You were their echo in disguise. You brought me back to the very wounds I escaped. You didn't love me deeply. You lingered deeply in my damage. You weren't my ex's mistake. You were mine. You knew my traumas and became them. You touched my pain and called it romance. You didn't stay to heal. You stayed to reopen. You loved the broken parts, not the healing ones. You made my ex look merciful. You were just a familiar ache in a new voice. You were not love. You were repetition dressed in patience. You weren't healing. You were slower bleeding. You weren't gentler. You were just quieter while destroying. You were love's mask with pain's voice. You weren't the light. You were shadow pretending. You whispered safety, but planted fear. You were not a chapter. You were a rewrite of the worst one. You promised warmth, delivered frost. You learned my story and still became a villain. You turned my vulnerability into your playground. You loved the version of me who stayed silent. You weren't a fresh start, just a recycled ending. You read my past, then wrote the same ending. You didn't treat me better, you just paused before the pain. You studied their mistakes and made them sweeter. You weren't love, you were a habit in disguise. You mirrored the wounds I feared most. You weren't truth, you were a better liar. You said all the right things and meant none of them. You reminded me what I ran from. You walked into my healing and sat on it. You weren't the closure. You were a crack wider than the last. You weren't peace. You were just quieter chaos. You didn't replace my ex. You replaced my hope. You painted yourself in light, but smelled of shadows. You were a second heartbreak wrapped in promises. You saw my brokenness and offered your silence. You made me forget how love should feel. You weren't my answer. You were the next question mark. You became the echo in my prayers for peace. You weren't safer, just slower with the knife. You never meant to stay, just long enough to confuse me. You weren't better, you were braver at pretending. You were my lesson in disguise, not my destiny. You used my softness as a stepping stone. You weren't honest. You were just harder to read. You hurt like a whisper, quiet but deadly. You were the prettier pain. You didn't carry my heart. You watched it fall. You weren't love's return. You were its rehearsal. You didn't light me up. You just didn't burn me fast. You walked in when healing began and reopened the wound. You made abandonment feel like it had manners. You arrived softly, but your exit screamed. You weren't my ex's opposite. You were just smoother with destruction. You weren't patient. You were calculating. You taught me how pain can wear perfume.